You're good to go.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary and Jim and everyone for all the work you do to make this class possible. Um, as you know, we're exploring the meaning of Jesus' miracles for today. And for the last couple of weeks, we have focused upon healing stories. Jesus healed people of so many diseases. Today, I would like for us to encounter the stories of spirit possession, the Gospel of Mark in particular, but also the Gospel of John tells us that Jesus dedicated himself to the liberation of people who were suffering from spirit possession. There is no doubt that this was a significant aspect of Jesus' activity, that by liberating people from evil spirits, he was extending and enacting the reign of God. In a world where God reigned, people would not suffer from spirit possession. Now, it's important, this topic, I think, for us in particular, in our time in history. Mental illness seems to have been involved in so many of the mass shootings that have occurred over the last few years. And after 2 years of the coronavirus, prolonged periods of isolation, people are frustrated. Many people emerged from the pandemic depressed. And as we now know, incidents of domestic violence have been on the rise. And so when we turn to these stories of how Jesus liberated people from spirit possession, I think it is important for us today. The Gospel of Mark describes Jesus' activity as an exorcist, as one who expelled unclean spirits. Now, probably we are all wondering whether it is not anachronistic to speak of spirit possession in psychological terms. Last week, just at the end of class, I recommended a book by a young scholar at Harvard, a book I had the privilege of publishing in a book series that I edit for Yale Press. His name is Giovanni Bazzana. And Ray, you might want to add this book to your library if you have not already done so. The book is called Having the Spirit of Christ. And look at the subtitle, Spirit Possession and Exorcism in Early Christ Groups. And the great strength of this book is that Bazzana demonstrates that the same phenomenon can be described both in psychological and in spiritual terms. What's the difference? Culture and educational level. It all depends upon the perspective and the experience of the one who is reporting the event. He begins the book with a fascinating description of a woman who came and knelt in front of the famous Shroud of Turin on the last occasion when it was exhibited in northern Italy. And as she knelt there, the woman fell into a trance. She began to speak in tongues, and she uttered what bystanders reported to be blasphemies. Of course, this was a spectacular event, and the newspapers interviewed Italian priests, Roman Catholic priests, who explained to the newspapers that this woman was suffering from mental illness. She had a psychological problem. And then guess what happened? 2 days later, the woman herself wrote an article for the newspaper in which she explained, no, it was not mental illness, it was spirit possession. I was possessed by a spirit, and it was the demon that forced me to utter those blasphemies. Well, what Giovanni Bazzana demonstrates is that all around the world, 2,000 years ago, and in some places still today, people experience spirit possession. More educated and cultured people interpret that in psychological terms. And in fact, in ancient literature, ancient texts from the time of Jesus already recognize that the phenomenon that we are describing can be described both in psychological and in spiritual terms. There's no contradiction. Let me give a couple of examples. The famous writer, late 1st century, early 2nd century, Lucian of Samosata. His essays are so much fun to read. And in one of these essays, he describes a Syrian exorcist who liberated possessed men and women, daimonuntes, he calls them, so possessed by demons, from their terrors by exorcism. And then he adds, he restored them to health and sent them away normal in mind. So you see, both categories are used to describe the phenomenon. The people who suffered from it said, we are spirit possessed. The educated philosopher, Lucian of Samosata, says that they were restored to a sound mind. One more example, Plutarch, the great Platonic philosopher, priest at Delphi, contemporary of St. Paul. He told a story about a politician, a Greek politician named Nicias. Now, excuse me, we may feel like some of our politicians today are also demon-possessed, but Plutarch describes Nicias as, quote, possessed, daimonion, and crazy, paraphronon, beside himself mentally. He stood up, this politician did, at a political gathering. He tore off his mantle. He ripped his tunic. He leapt up half naked and ran out of the theater. We may find ourselves wishing that some of our politicians would leap up and run away. But you see, Plutarch describes the same phenomenon using both the language of demon possession and the language of mental illness. In one of the texts that we're going to read together carefully this morning, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac. Please notice in verse 15 of that story, it says that after Jesus had liberated this tortured man from the legion of unclean spirits that were possessing him, he is then described in verse 15 Take a look at it. It says that, thank you so much, Mary, for bringing it up. It says in verse 15, they came to Jesus and saw the man possessed by demons. So there is no doubt that he was demon possessed. But now look, it says, he was what? He was sitting there clothed and in his right mind. The very man who had the legion. So you see the same language, the language of spirit possession and of psychological language is used to describe this phenomenon. And in fact, I can explain why this is the case. Educated Greeks and Romans, upper class people, interpreted demon possession, spirit possession, as psychological illness. And they used a variety of terms to describe it. So, athumia, which we would translate depression. Mania, we still have that word, mania, madness. Aponoia, desperation. Paranoia, derangement, madness. These and other words were used to describe psychological disorders that resulted from intense pain and grief. And among the educated, the therapy for this, the cure for it, was not exorcism, but Jim, I'm calling you out because of your mastery of psychology. The therapy for this among the educated was cognitive psychology 2,000 years ago. It was the guidance of the soul, psychagogy, it was called in Greek. And it was the philosopher, usually, not the doctor, who was called upon in order to lead depressed, desperate, deranged people back into the social order. So there is a Socratic dialogue called the Axiochus that describes a man who had a close brush with death, and he became so depressed that he locked himself up in his house and refused to open the door. Someone who cared about him ran and called Socrates, who came to the door, Jim, and applied cognitive psychology to lead this man back into social relationships. Similarly, the great Cicero, you've heard of him, the Roman lawyer and magistrate. When his little daughter, his beloved daughter, Tullia, when she died in childbirth, Cicero sank into a deep depression. He retired from politics. Can you imagine one of our politicians today retiring in the middle of his career? He secluded himself in his country villa at Tusculum, and then he called for a cognitive therapy applied by Stoic philosophers to heal him of his pain, his grief that was making him depressed and desperate. But among lower class people in the Roman Empire, what we would today call subaltern populations, so among the lower classes, psychological suffering was experienced and understood as a result of invasion by spirits. And this is because of the vulnerability of people who live at the margin of society, the vulnerability of the oppressed. It's the social reality that underlies this experience of spirit possession. Can I tell a personal story? Back in 1992, not long after I had arrived with my wife and family in Dayton, I led a traveling seminar of 17 students from United Theological Seminary to the north of Brazil. We traveled for 3 weeks through all the cities of the north, Recife, Salvador. We wound up in Rio de Janeiro. And there, I took the class to what was then the largest church in the world. Perhaps you've heard about it. It's called the Universal Kingdom of God Church. Listen, class, they had 100,000 members. And they had worship services 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. When I arrived with my class, the church was absolutely full. We had trouble finding a place to sit. Can you guess what this church specialized in? Why did it attract so many people? It specialized in demon possession, the exorcism of evil spirits. And when I was there with the class, not long after we sat down and the people in the sanctuary began to sing and pray, a man stood up in the middle of the congregation and began to shout blasphemies. The deacons of the church came to him from all sides, laid their hands upon him, and began the exorcism. Now, it won't surprise you to know that the people who filled this church in Brazil were people who lived at the margins of society, people who slept on the sidewalks or tried to spend the night in a cardboard shack. In Rio de Janeiro, I saw the largest ghetto I've ever seen in my life. 500,000 people living in a ghetto, many of whom went out and picked through the garbage dump to find their breakfast early in the morning. These were the people who went to that Universal Kingdom of God church looking for freedom from the social forces that constantly communicated to them every day, your life is worth nothing. You're of less value than a cigarette butt on the streets of the Gold Coast of Rio. So now, with all of that conceptual background in mind, I apologize for spending so long on the background. I would invite all of us to turn our attention to a couple of passages from the Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel. Mary, I would like to begin with Mark chapter 1, verses 23 to 28. Jesus is in Capernaum in Lower Galilee, and he has gone into one of the synagogues of the Jews. And so take a look at Mark chapter 1, verse 23. Mary, at the very top of the handout, where it says, "And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit." The Greek text says, anthropos in pneumati akatharto. Now, that language, unclean spirit, is clearly a Jewish formulation from the time of Jesus. There are abundant parallels from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it probably reflects the Jewish belief that fallen angels, the angels who, according to First Enoch and the book of Jubilees, and a bizarre little story in Genesis chapter 6, you may remember that the fallen angels came down to earth and had intercourse with mortal women. And the progeny of that illicit intercourse were understood by Jews in the first century to be spirits of impurity, unclean spirits. That's the language that is used here in Mark's gospel. Now, look at the next verse, verse 24. This poor man stands up in the synagogue like the one that I experienced with my class in Brazil, and he cries out. The Greek verb is anakratzo. Can you all say that with me? Anakratzo. Thank you. It's an onomatopoetic word, as you can tell. It sounds like what it means. He cries out, and look what he says. What is there between us and you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. 2,000 years later, even in reading this text, in reading the words of the demon-possessed man, I don't know about you, I feel a chill, a tingling going up and down my spine. Now notice that the spirit-possessed man addresses Jesus first. He initiates the dialogue. In all of the accounts that we have, class, of exorcism in the first century, this is unique. This is the only one in ancient literature where the spirit-possessed person speaks first. I spoke earlier about Lucian of Samosata. He tells stories of exorcism, and in all of his stories, it is the exorcist who speaks first and asks the spirit, how did you come into the victim's body? Who are you? The exorcist asks. And what is your name? But in the Gospel of Mark, it is the demon-possessed person who speaks first. And class, in my opinion, this is our first opportunity today to ask the question of the meaning of these stories for us today. In my opinion, here is what it is. The sufferer recognizes Jesus. He knows who Jesus is. Well, how can this be? How can this be explained? Jim, in my opinion, the best psychological interpretation of the Gospel of Mark is the one offered by the Canadian psychologist and New Testament scholar John Miller. He's not only a psychologist, he also has a PhD in New Testament studies, and he was the chair of the Historical Jesus seminar at the Society of Biblical Literature for many years. And he has a wonderful little book published by HarperCollins. Ray, this is another one for your library. It's called Jesus at 30. And John Miller pays special attention to this story in the Gospel of Mark and to other stories in the Gospel of Mark where the sufferer recognizes Jesus, where the sufferer sees in Jesus someone who is capable of helping him. And he explains it, Jim, in this way. He says, what the sufferers recognized in Jesus was a person in whom the inner conflicts of life had been resolved. A person who had resolved his own inner conflicts and who was therefore at their disposal. He had resolved his own conflicts and he was available to help others. To me, that explanation makes sense. And it has, Larry, it has a result for us today. When people are drawn to the church, when they are drawn to the church as seekers, when they are seeking help for their own suffering, for loneliness, for the depression, it is our job, if we want to follow Jesus, it is our job to first seek the resolution of our own inner conflicts so that we can be free and available, so that we can be at the disposal of others. I don't know if you draw the same meaning from this story that I do, but I think Larry and Jim, what is suggested here is that the people of Epiphany and the pastors of our great church have a role to play in seeking resolution of our inner conflicts so that we are ready to put ourselves at the disposal of others who come to our church seeking for help. Now look at the next verse, verse 25. And Jesus rebuked the spirit, saying, and I'm going to translate literally, be muzzled. I think your text says, be silenced. The Greek verb is phimotheti, phimotheti. And guess what, class? This is a magical word. It is found in the Greek magical papyri. It belongs to binding spells, spells that are used to bind people that are speaking evil, even people that are gossiping against you. Jesus rebuked the spirit, saying, phimotheti, be muzzled, be silenced, and come out of him. Now, class, do you think it is significant that Jesus uses a magic word here? In other words, he speaks to the sufferer, to the spirit-possessed person, in a language that he can understand. He doesn't try to explain to the man, oh, you're just confused. you're not really suffering. Let me teach you something different. No, he speaks to the man in the language of his own suffering. He reaches out across the gap and Jesus dares to use the language of exorcism. For this reason, later in the Gospel of Mark, the scribes and the Pharisees accuse Jesus of being in league with Beelzebul, the prince of demons. You see, Jesus runs the risk. He runs the risk of associating himself with what some people would have regarded as a very questionable social type. Now, there's a lesson for us here, I think. There is a risk involved in putting yourself at the disposal of those who are possessed by spirits, who suffer psychological traumas. I have to confess, class, that when I have a student at the university who is suffering psychologically and who turns to me as a professor looking for help, my first instinct is to explain that I'm not a psychologist, that I'm only a professor. I'm reluctant to enter into the language of the student's pain and to make myself available and vulnerable. But on those rare occasions when I have found the strength to admit that I too suffer from uncertainty, sadness, grief, I find that I've been able to be helpful to students in a greater way. Now look at the next verse, verse 26. And the unclean spirit convulsed him. Frightening episode. The unclean spirit convulsed him and cried out in a loud voice and went out of him. Verse 27. And all were amazed and inquired of each other, saying, who is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Notice that Jesus' therapy, his exorcism, is carried out by a word of command. The people who heard it said it was a teaching, a new teaching with authority. And this contrasts with other accounts of exorcism that are found, for example, in the first century. Jewish historian Josephus, in his Antiquities, he tells us that a certain Eleazar, a Jewish exorcist, in the presence of Vespasian, the emperor, and his sons, and a number of Roman soldiers, liberated a man possessed by demons. And then Josephus says, this was the way in which he did it. He put up to the nose of the possessed man a ring, a gold ring, which had underneath its seal one of the herbal roots that were prescribed by Solomon. And then, as the man smelled it, he drew out the demon through the man's nostrils. And then, wishing to convince the bystanders and to prove to them that he had the power to exercise, Eleazar placed a foot basin full of water a little way off, and he commanded the demon, as it went out of the man, to overturn the basin of water in order to make known to the spectators that he had left the man. Isn't that an amazing story in Josephus? But I'm sure you also notice the contrast. Jesus does not set up a basin of water. He doesn't put a ring up to the nose of the man and draw the spirit out by a concealed herbal root. Rather, he speaks. He speaks a word of authority, and the demon comes out. Now, because our time is moving along so quickly, I want to turn Mary to the next story in the Gospel of Mark, an amazing story, the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac, in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. Are you still with me? Good. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. So Jesus and his disciples, they come to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, to the region of the Gerasenes. Now, this is a region populated by Gentiles, by non-Jews. Gerasa was a big city. It was part of the Decapolis, the 10 cities on the east side of Jordan. It was wonderfully excavated by the Yale archaeologist Carl Kraling, who published a big fat book called Gerasa. Ray, maybe you can help me find a copy of this book for my library. I wish I had it. So Jesus is confronted here in Gerasa by a man with an unclean spirit who is crying out and shrieking. And Jesus takes action to liberate this man from his terrible affliction, once again by means of a dialogue. He engages in a dialogue with the one possessed by spirits. Now, for an understanding of this story, and in order to get the meaning for us today, it is important to look for clues to the origin of the affliction of this poor demon-possessed man. And I think the best job has been done by a British scholar, a scholar of the ancient Mediterranean, named John Duncan Derrett. And he has observed that the setting of this story is what? The graveyard. This man is living among the tombs, dwelling among the tombs. And so Derrett notices this, and he also calls attention to the fact that this man is engaged in self-mutilation all day and all night. He is cutting himself with stones, and he is howling. And so Derrett offers the explanation that the location and the behavior of this man are typical of mourning rituals in the first century. In this case, the mourning ritual, the grief ritual, has gotten out of control. But the point that Derek establishes is that loss and grief is the context of this story. This poor sufferer is haunted. He is haunted by something. He is unable to move on, to move beyond his loss and his grief. Now, I think that makes the story so much more meaningful to us today. When I think about all the friends, the mentors, the teachers that I have lost during the last 2 years, the family members who died in the last couple of years. We are not told, in the case of this man, whether the loss that he is grieving was the death of a loved one, or whether it is some other loss, perhaps a sense of failing, of disappointment, perhaps a loss of character or confidence. But he is haunted. That's the point. He is haunted, and he is unable to move on. Now, with that in mind, let's look at the text for further insight into the meaning of this story for today. The text says in chapter 5, verses 2 to 3, that the man comes out from the tombs where he has been living. It's a literal translation. Lived among the tombs. 2,000 years ago, in this region of the Mediterranean, people were often buried in cave-like openings, dug into the rock, openings that were large enough for a person to enter on foot, large enough to allow a person to even stand upright inside of the cave tomb. Such a place then could provide shelter for a person who was haunted, who was suffering from spirit possession, who had no other place to live. By the way, Larry Hopsis and others, if I'm ever able to organize a traveling seminar for all of us from Epiphany, to travel to the Eastern Mediterranean, I will take you to the great necropolis outside the city of Hierapolis in Turkey. The modern name is Pamukkale. And my wife, Diane, who is with us this morning, she was there with me a couple of years ago, and she saw these incredible tombs large enough for a person to live in and to dwell. Now, the problem from a Jewish point of view is that the tombs are ritually impure. And that is because of the presence of decaying bodies and bones. The worst kind of uncleanness, the worst impurity, according to the law of the rabbis, was corpse impurity, impurity from contact with a corpse. So a graveyard was a place where a person would be especially vulnerable, especially exposed to unclean spirits. Now, this is another place, class, where I think the text provides us with an opportunity for drawing out the meaning of the story. And I would put it like this: the fact that this haunted, grieving, suffering man has decided to go and make his dwelling place among the tombs suggests to me that the forces that are haunting him are impelling him toward death. Isn't that a profound thought psychologically? Sometimes when we cannot move on from a loss or a grief, we find ourselves wanting to join. We find ourselves being engulfed and impelled toward the loss, toward the grief. And as we as a church seek to be ministers to those who are grieving, who are haunted, it's important for us to realize that when the grief is so deep, it impels people toward death. Now, I'd like to direct attention to a phrase at the end of chapter 5, verse 2. In your text, it says, a man with an unclean spirit. Do you see that? A man with an unclean spirit. But that's not what the Greek says. The Greek says literally, a man in an unclean spirit. And I think the Greek preposition in should be taken literally and should be given its full force. In other words, this poor man's identity, everything that he is, has been swallowed up by the possessing spirit. So that, as we will soon discover, he speaks with the demon's voice. He even tries to protect the demon that has swallowed him up. And so the point is, he tries to protect the demon of grief and loss. He tries to prevent it from being evicted from his body and soul. He tries to hold on to the very thing that is the instrument of his own torture. Well, the people who told us this story, they probably understood that this man was a Gentile, a non-Jew. As we said, the land east of the Sea of Galilee was predominantly inhabited by Gentiles, even though some Jews lived there. In chapter 5, verse 7, take a look at it. The man uses a term for God. Look at what he says. He says, what do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? Now, that expression translates the Greek theos hoopsistos, and it is a typical way that Gentiles referred to the God of Israel, theos hoopsistos. And finally, the association of the possessing spirits with pigs. Do you see that in chapter 5, verses 11 to 13? That also suggests a Gentile context, a non-Jewish context, because, of course, pigs were viewed as unclean animals. And this is a fact that was very well known. Now, take a look at verse 3. Verse 3 says, no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. Now, this may reflect an attempt by the inhabitants of Gerasa, the local people, to prevent the demoniac from harming them. They're going to tie him up to keep him from doing other people harm. And in fact, in ancient art, for example, the Aramaic incantation bowls that were discovered by archaeologists, they picture, I wish I had a picture of them to show you this morning, they picture demons being bound or tied up to prevent them from hurting other people. So I think that verse 3 contains an element of social irony. In other words, the method that people have for dealing with people who are possessed with spirits is simply to tie them up further, to bind them again. They double down on the possession. And class, forgive me, I think there is a lesson for us here today. Instead of putting our social resources seriously at work in order to deal with the problems of psychological suffering and mental illness, our society today often just punishes people further, tying them up further. And the church, I think, needs to call that out, as I believe the storytellers do in this text by means of irony. Now, look at verse 4. In English, verse 4 says, "For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces." Now, the Greek verbs that are translated here, diaspastai and suntetraftai, are both in the passive voice. I think in order to indicate that this man is no longer in control of his own actions. He is the victim of external forces. At least that is the way he feels. He feels his own passivity, his own lack of any agency. And so verse 6, the demon-possessed man asks Jesus, "What have you to do with me?" In Greek, it says, "Ti emoi taisoi." Now, that is an idiom. It's an ancient idiom, and it has two shades of meaning. First, it means, what is the cause of enmity between us? What problem do you have with me? But the same idiom can also be used to convey, what do we have in common? What is there between us? I would argue, class, that the ambiguity here is intentional and that it is important. This poor suffering man wants to know why Jesus is hostile toward the spirits that possess him, but he is also expressing the consciousness of something that might be in common between them at some deep level. This poor possessed man has an inkling that he and Jesus might have something in common. Now, notice that in verse 7, the demon invokes Jesus' name. Now, that is a technique that was used in ancient magic for gaining control over another power. And the demon then says, I adjure you. Do you see that? Verse 7. I adjure you. By God, do not torment me. The Greek verb is horkizo. Horkizo. Can you say that with me for a minute? Horkizo. And this is a verb that is always used in exorcisms. Do you see what the demon is doing? He is making a preemptive move on Jesus. He's trying to exorcise, to drive the power out of Jesus. It is yet another element of irony, I would say deliberate parody in this story, that the demon invokes the name of God. I horkizo, I adjure you by God, do not torment me. And he uses exorcistic terminology. The demon pleads, do not torment me. And so notice that the demon's plea, don't torment me, is accompanied by an action. Look at verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. He literally, the Greek says, he threw himself on the ground before Jesus. Now, class, I would argue that these actions and words taken together suggest a profound mixture of avoidance and attraction. Notice that the demoniac does not simply run away to avoid Jesus. He could have done that. If he recognized him, he could have simply turned tail and run off. But instead, he runs toward him. He seeks him out. He falls down in front of him. And yet, when he addresses Jesus, he pleads for Jesus to leave him alone. So, in the demoniac's approach, his falling down at Jesus' feet, and his supplication, leave me alone, there is a fascinating combination of things here. The demon is suffering from a profound mixture of avoidance and attraction. It suggests that at some level, this poor lost human being, trapped inside a destructive grief that still haunts him, at some level, he is aware of his plight. He wants to be liberated from it, even though his words communicate something different. And as our church, as Epiphany, tries to open itself to a ministry of healing to those who are suffering in our own time, it's important, I think, to be sensitive to this dynamic of both attraction and avoidance. In verse 8, the storyteller parenthetically explains that Jesus, while the demon-possessed man was falling down and beseeching Jesus to leave him alone, that while this is going on, Jesus had been repeatedly saying, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." So, what is being represented here in this wonderful text is a dynamic, agonistic dialogue, a contest between two forces. There's a lesson for us here, I think, as well. If we want to follow Jesus in embracing a ministry of liberation, there are going to be agonistic moments. There are going to be moments of contestation. Now, the turning point in this encounter between Jesus and the possessed man is the discovery of the demon's name. In the Greek magical papyri, I've made reference to this text several times. You can get this text online. It's been translated into English. The Greek Magical Papyri by Hans Dieter Betz. When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I was involved in that translation project and contributed to it as part of my graduate student duties. Well, in the Greek Magical Papyri, you will discover that knowing the name, finding out the name of a spirit is decisive for acquiring control over it and casting it out. Now, in this case, it turns out that the name of the demon is what?
Legion.
Legion.
We have run over at this point.
Oh no, Mary, I'm such a bad boy. I can't. Why am I like this? I get so involved in the text. I lose track of time. Graduating students for many years have given me as a graduation present a watch, a wristwatch, and they are all piled up in a drawer in my bedroom at home in Dayton. Too bad I don't remember to wear them. So, Mary, if everyone in the class is agreed, because some people need to go to church, some people are in the choir. If it's all right with you, let's pause our class right here and come back to this point next week, because I think the most important meaning of this text for today is still awaiting us. It is still ahead of us, and I don't want us to miss it.
Okay, so we'll start next week with back at the 5th chapter of Mark.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who joined in our class today. I apologize for my poor management of time and for talking too much. I will do better next week. And in 2 weeks, I hope to be back with you in person.
Ooh.
Can't wait to return to my wonderful wife and my 3-year-old granddaughter, and to all of you at Epiphany. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'll see you in person by Zoom next week. I'll see you by Zoom next week and in person in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.